Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which, for those of you that don't know, is an international community of people working around the world, working together to help reform the financial system. Our overall purpose is to help to drive up the levels of transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness within the financial sector. We believe the finance industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and also to political stability too. We really can't overestimate just how significant the financial sector is. It therefore follows that it's remarkably important that the financial services sector behaves itself. We all know what can happen when the financial industry doesn't. We get things like scams and scandals. We get corruption. We get dirty money flowing around the world's financial ecosystem. And of course, we get things like the global financial crisis, which caused incalculable amounts of harm, both economically and on a human level as well. I believe I'm right in saying that according to the Oxford University research on this topic, approximately 10,000 people around the world committed suicide as a direct consequence of the effects to them of the global financial crisis. And of course, we've all been living with various kinds of austerity measures as well. I guess the point I'm making is that it is remarkably important that the financial industry does behave itself. And I'm making this point, of course, because one of the wonderful things that Violation Tracker does, as you either know or are about to know, is it shows very clearly the kind of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct and mis-selling that has caused the financial sector, unfortunately, to become the least trustworthy of all industries. And that's a real problem, of course, ladies and gentlemen, because the financial sector, almost by definition, has to be trustworthy to function successfully. The word credit comes from the Latin word credere, which means to believe in. If you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, the entire financial industry is built on the notion that we can believe in it. But how can we believe in it? How can we trust it if it behaves in a manner that causes distrust? As you'll see, no doubt, during the course of today's session, the levels of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct and mis-selling by the financial services sector is remarkably high, and that's a real problem. And that's why when I stumbled across Violation Tracker, the US version, back in, I think it was April last year, I was really delighted to learn about it. I was delighted to see the amount of very high quality data within it. I was delighted to learn that the data is all legitimate from official sources, that there are formal links within the database to the originating sources of that data. And it really does have a long list of reasons why it's very, very easy to like Violation Tracker a great deal. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for participating in today's session. Please, please, please don't think of yourselves as just passive observers of what's about to happen. In fact, I'd go further than that. Please don't think of yourselves as just passive observers of the Violation Tracker UK story. I would really like all of you, every single one of you, to find a role for yourselves within the Violation Tracker UK story. For example, by helping to spread the word about it. Social media is very much an ally in this regard. Neither us at Transparency Task Force nor the people at Good Jobs First in Washington, DC, neither of us have money to throw at this. It's a wonderful resource. We want everybody that should learn about it to get to know about it. And that can only happen through goodwill and through word of mouth and through harnessing the incredible power of social media. So given that it's a remarkably valuable tool, a remarkably valuable utility, and it's available to everybody free of charge, please do take upon yourself the role of helping to share the word about this. There's been a really large group of people working together on this over the last year and a half or so. Everybody's participated on it's a team effort basis. If I could invite you all to pick up on that vibe, that would be really, really good. I could carry on talking about this topic for a long time, but I won't. I'd much rather pass over to Greg Leroy, who's going to introduce himself and some background, and then he'll be passing on to Phil Mattera. Greg, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andy, and hello, everyone. It's just great to be with you. In fact, this is our 9th or 10th training session now, and it's the largest turnout we've had yet for a session. I see 49 and counting here, and perhaps it's appropriate because in both the United States and in the UK, the banking/financial services sector stands out for the heaviest fined by dollars or pounds industry that we found in both nations. We'd like to gratefully acknowledge this financial support of 3 funders who have helped make this website and database possible: the Jaffe Charitable Trust, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and the Riva and David Logan Foundation. We also really appreciate the guidance of the advisory group chaired by Andy and the Transparency Task Force, and certainly take today's turnout as further testimony to the influence and reach of TTF in the space for financial services reform. We'd also like to thank our academic advisor, who you're going to hear from soon, Dr. Anish Raghunandan at the London School of Economics. And we'd also like to thank our lead UK-based researcher, Anthony K. Bagley. And with that, I'll introduce Phil Mattera, our research director and the mastermind of both Violation Tracker here in the US and in the UK. Phil?
Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what is in the database for those of you who have not had a chance to look at it. So I'll open up some slides here. So Violation Tracker UK, which you can reach at violationtrackeruk.org, is, as Andy mentioned, it's a free resource. It's a database of misconduct in the broad sense of the term. We've collected data from more than 40 regulatory agencies throughout the United Kingdom. And all of our data comes from official government sources. So these are not allegations, they're not reports, rumors. These are all fully documented cases that have been resolved and are part of the public record. We brought together more than 63,000 such cases. These cases have total monetary penalties of over £12 billion, although we include many cases with no monetary penalty, because we found that particularly in areas like the environment and workplace safety, there's a lot of use of cautions or notices. Now, the financial sector is different. There are a lot more financial penalties. So as you'll see in a moment, they show up more prominently. We also aggregate the data for a universe of about 670 parent companies, because in the individual entries that we have, usually the parent company is not mentioned, but we take it upon ourselves to identify the parent so that we can give you an overview for each one of those large companies. So here's a breakdown by category of the cases that we have in the database. So you'll see that the largest number of cases is in the safety area. That includes workplace safety. Financial cases are much smaller in terms of number of cases, but as I mentioned, they'll account for a lot more in the fines. We have several ways of researching, accessing the data. On our homepage, we have a simple search box where you can just plug in the company name by itself, or in combination with one of those 6 categories I mentioned, or you can also limit it to a particular regulator. We then have a page with kind of pre-formatted summary lists for each of those parent companies I mentioned, for each of the industries in which those parents operate, for each of the offense groups, for each of the agencies, and each of the countries in which the parents are headquartered, because we include parents from around the world if they have UK operations. And then finally, we have an advanced search page where you can mix and match those variables and more to do a custom search. So here's an example of an individual entry. This one is from Barclays, which they paid a monetary penalty of over 284 million pounds for foreign exchange market manipulation. And we have a narrative description of what was involved in the case. You know, we tell you the agency, and then at the bottom, there's a link to the source that we used, which in this case was a press release issued by the Financial Conduct Authority back in 2015. And all of our entries have such links back to the official source. So you can check to see that we got things right, but also in many cases get more detail than we're able to provide in these entries. Here's a tabulation of the parent companies with the largest aggregate penalties. You can see that Airbus is at the top because of a couple of large bribery cases. Nortel is second. They're no longer in business, but they had a large pension case. But then Barclays is there with over 500 million in penalties. Other familiar names like Rolls-Royce, but then you'll see there are other large banks featuring prominently on the list, both UK ones like Lloyd's and foreign ones like UBS from Switzerland, JP Morgan Chase from here in the US, and Deutsche Bank in Germany. If we focus on financial penalties, and we defining that broadly, including banking, competition, fraud, tax, and accounting, the company with the largest aggregate penalties is actually Credit Suisse, with over 300 million pounds, and JP Morgan Chase with over 174 million pounds. And just to clarify, the reason why Barclays is lower down on the list is that a number of their penalties are not in the financial sector. They may be a financial company, but they have they've had substantial penalties in other areas, such as their employment practices. But for purely financial penalties, it's actually some of the foreign banks that are at the very top. But then Lloyd's comes in, and Barclays is not too far behind. Here's a here's a breakdown by the agency in the bringing cases in the financial area. And of course, the Financial Conduct Authority and its predecessor, the Financial Services Authority, account for the largest amount in aggregate penalties, over 4.5 billion pounds. Serious Fraud Office at over 2 billion. Actually, the HMRC has the most cases, but that's because we're including tax cases here, and a lot of these are relatively small tax avoidance or tax evasion cases. The Prudential Regulation Authority has a surprisingly small number of cases, and the total is not that large either. And some of the other agencies have relatively few cases as well. So I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Phil, thank you very much indeed. If you don't mind, Phil, I'm going to put a question to you just to help ensure that everybody understands this point. Could you just talk us through the process of gathering the data, getting it into the database and collating it in the way that you do? I really want everybody to understand the amount of work involved in doing that. That would be great if you could cover that for us, please. Thank you.
Yes, so as I mentioned, all of our information comes from official government sources, preferably online sources, so that we can provide links back to a source for the user to actually look at. Now, the government regulators do not all provide the information in a consistent way. In a few cases, there are data sets that we can download and just incorporate in the database. That's the ideal circumstance. In other cases, we have to use methods such as scraping to go to a website, and we have to write code which goes in and automatically retrieves data from a government website, such as the Health and Safety Executive, where they have a big their own search engine, but there's no easy way to download the full data set. We have to go in with computer code and retrieve it. But particularly in the financial area, a lot of our cases come from looking at individual documents, individual press releases or announcements. And we go through, for example, every press release that the Financial Conduct Authority has issued, and we review each one and figure out which ones are relevant to the information that we're trying to collect. And then we manually extract those pieces of information and put them into our database. So as you can see, it's a very labor-intensive, it's a very laborious process, but we think the result is useful.
For sure, certainly is. Useful is an understatement, Phil. Thank you very much. Well, we can have a quick Q&A or discussion round now before we go over to Dr. Raghunandan. So does anybody have any comments or questions they'd like to share at this point? Please raise your hand digitally if you can, or literally if you can't. And we'll see if we can spend a bit of time doing that now. Mr. Nigel Cairns, and then we're going to go to Hugh Price. So everybody speaking, please take a moment to introduce yourself. So Nigel, tell us a bit about who you are and then move on to your point. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, Nigel Cairns from Devon, victim of bank misconduct. A question maybe for Phil. I think I know the answer anyway, but I'd like to hear what he's got to say about this particular facet. I'm wondering if the figures for the banks include deferred prosecution agreement sums. For instance, HSBC were given a deferred prosecution by the DOJ for Mexican drug infringements some years ago. Have they appeared either in the American or the British figures? And if they had have done, where would HSBC appear on the list that we've just seen, for instance? That's my question.
Well, yes, we do. The answer is that yes, we do have data on deferred prosecution agreements, both in our US data, where there are a lot more of them, and also in the UK, where that practice has been used by the Serious Fraud Office, for example. So yes, when there is a case of that sort, and there's a financial penalty associated with that agreement, we include that as a fine or a penalty. We actually use the term penalty to include both outright fines, settlements, and other kinds of monetary payments that are made by companies as the result of a case of misconduct. HSBC is in the list. They just happen to be a little further down the list from what I showed you on the slide. So
my point is that
them out by any means.
I understand that they won't, because it's a deferred prosecution agreement that we're talking about, they won't actually have had to have paid the fine as long as they're not forced to do so because they've behaved themselves. Is that a correct?
Well, in the US at least, I mean, there's almost always a financial payment involved with a deferred prosecution agreement. So they, and some of them are quite substantial. I mean, that's part of the logic. I think it's kind of a dubious logic, but there's a logic that prosecutors use in these arrangements. The notion is that, if you tell a company that, you know, we're not going to prosecute you criminally now, but, you know, we're going to hold the threat of a prosecution over you for the future, but we're also going to make you pay a financial penalty now. This is supposedly going to be a deterrent against, you know, future misconduct, or it's going to get company to change its practices. In the US, at least, we've seen many examples of companies that have entered into deferred prosecution agreements only to break the rules again later. And one of the problems that we have in the US is that the prosecutors don't do much about that. In some cases, they've even given companies a second deferred prosecution agreement, which makes the whole thing kind of laughable. So, you know, we've worked with a group called Public Citizen here in the US, which has looked closely at this arrangement, and they've done a couple of reports on this problem using our data.
Phil, we have a question from Sandra Wolf saying the database is useful, but I wonder how far it ends up reflecting the fact that some industries or sectors are more heavily regulated than others, and so omits infringements where there is inadequate regulation.
Well, of course, I mean, you know, where we can only reflect those penalties and violations that are brought. And there are a couple of problems. One are cases in which agencies are not doing their job at all, and they're not bringing cases. In fact, I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how UK regulators are now being encouraged to put more emphasis on, you know, making the UK financial services sector more competitive. And I mean, they're, you know, which doesn't seem to me to really to be the job of regulators. But anyway, that's the current government policy apparently in the UK. So we have the problems of when regulators are not regulating, or when they are regulating and imposing either meager or non-existent financial penalties. So that's you know, that's what we're reflecting, you know, both the kind of the good and the bad of regulation. And we're just documenting what the regulators are doing or not doing.
Thank you, Nigel and Greg and Phil. That was a really interesting exchange. I'll talk in a moment about the significance of Violation Tracker UK in terms of understanding the effectiveness of our regulatory framework. But before we go there, let's go to Mr. Hugh Price. Hugh, please do introduce yourself. And if anybody else has any comments or questions, please do wave your hand when I ask you to in a short while. Hugh, please take yourself off mute, then go for it, sir. Thank you. Hugh, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself first, Hugh. Hugh, you're on mute. So please unmute yourself. There we go.
Does that work?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I do apologize. Andy, first of all, many thanks and congratulations on getting this together today. And over the last few weeks, we've been very much involved in this approach through Zoom. I'm a solicitor, a semi-retired solicitor now, and I've lost out big time with financial services and my pension. My IFA went rogue in about 2008, around about the time of the financial collapse in the world, global collapse. And he accepted undisclosed commission secret bribes to my detriment. My concern, therefore, is not so much the UK, but the unregulated financial sector, which goes out into Jersey to Guernsey and so on, where obviously in the UK we have our own regulator. They have their regulators as well, but are nowhere near as proficient or effective as the UK regulator. And I'm wondering to what extent you're able to give us a steer into that, because I've just tried to look at the violation tracker this afternoon rather, and I noticed that it only relates to United States violators, at least on the screen I've got in front of me, rather than the UK. Is that going to be changed, or am I simply looking at the wrong database?
What you're looking at there, Hugh, is the database I saw about a year and a half ago, the US database.
All right.
So we'll put a link to the homepage of Violation Tracker UK into the chat in a minute. But you've actually touched on a really interesting topic, which is, you know, what about outside the UK? So Phil, could we ask you to talk about ideas you and your colleagues have for capturing data in the future for non-UK and non-US regulators? Thank you.
Yeah, so first let me clarify. So there are two different databases. There's Violation Tracker, the original Violation Tracker, which covers cases brought by regulators in the United States. And that, that's quite large now. That has about 496,000 cases in it. Then there's Violation Tracker UK, which is the new database, which includes cases brought by UK regulators. In both of those instances, we include cases brought by companies from around the world, but only relevant to their operations in either the US or the UK. So, there's two different data sets, but they're structured in a similar manner. Now, we realize that there's more to the world than the US and the UK. So we've been thinking about, where to go next. We realize it's not really practical to create one of these databases for every country or even every major country. So what we're thinking about is a multi-country version of Violation Tracker with more streamlined content, which we would focus on cases involving larger, particularly publicly traded companies, because we think those are of the most interest to the largest number of users. So we're taking very preliminary steps now in planning to create that kind of multi-country database where we would not try to capture every last case, because if you look at either the US or the UK data set, there are a lot of cases that involve very small companies and often very small amounts of penalties, which are going to be of interest to some researchers, but we think that the ones involving the largest companies are the ones that make most sense when we try to globalize this resource. Now, another distinction I should make, and I noticed there was a question in the chat about this, is whether we only include cases in which there are monetary penalties. And here there's a difference between the US and the UK data sets. In the US, we only include cases with monetary penalties of $5,000 or more. And that's because in the US, the use of some kind of monetary penalty is almost universal among the regulators. So it made sense to limit it to those cases and even to eliminate the very smallest amounts. In the UK, on the other hand, there's much greater use of these cautions or notices, and we decided to include those, otherwise we would be leaving out a large part of regulatory activity. So in the UK, we have many cases without monetary penalties. We also have many cases with very small monetary penalties. So that's one distinction people should keep in mind between the two data sets.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil, and thank you, Anne-Marie, for popping that question into the chat. That's great. Again, I'm going to go to gallery view. Just wave a hand at me if you want to ask a question or make a comment at this point. Otherwise, we're going to go straight to Dr. Raghunandan. Let's go to Anish. Anish, over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, so I'll keep this pretty brief because I see that there seems to be a fair amount of interest, number of questions. So just by way of introduction, my name is Dr. Anish Raghunandan. I'm a faculty member at the LSE. And I do a lot of work kind of in two what I think are semi-related areas. One is, of course, trying to understand what you might call the financial determinants of non-financial conduct, right? The idea is that firms aren't necessarily inherently evil, right? So when they do bad things, there must be some sort of impetus. What is it? What are those impetuses? How can we figure those out? The other thing that I work on kind of relatedly is trying to figure out whether, what is the role of the investment community in all of this? And more specifically, I've started to do a lot of work on ESG investing. So one thing that, you know, and I think this is something that's quite relevant to, given that this is this is a session that is targeted at many members of the investment community, even if not necessarily the ones that I've been studying most closely. But what I wanted to sort of highlight was just one key example of my research in this area and how it kind of relies on Violation Tracker and how it's kind of, I think, you know, how Violation Tracker can lead to the kinds of rigorous analyses that have immediate practical relevance. So as many of us are probably aware, ESG investing, right, an investment that considers environmental, social, and corporate governance related factors, is kind of exploding in terms of importance. And, you know, if you open the FT every day, you'll see a dozen news articles about ESG investing, and it's becoming more and more mainstream, right? And more asset managers and investment funds are incorporating ESG, or at least claiming to incorporate ESG principles into their investment decisions. Now, of course, the natural follow-up question to ask is whether this is legit on average, or whether this seems to be not much more than greenwashing. And this is where understanding Violation Tracker can really help, because in my view, there's really two forms of ESG related information about the companies these firms are investing in, right? There's what I would call hard information. What are these companies actually up to, right? And this is where we need to rely on things like carbon emissions, or on things like a company's track record with stakeholders, which you can identify in Violation Tracker. And then there's what I'd call, you know, soft information, right? The idea that companies say a lot of nice, warm and fuzzy things, but you can't really verify them. And the problem with ESG scores, right? And so many investment products rely on these commercial ESG scores. And the problem with these scores is that they tend to rely on the soft information, right? A company just said it did nice things, so we just trust them. But if you look at Violation Tracker in the US, it turns out maybe we should be a little more skeptical. You know, my research on average finds that the ESG funds actually pick firms with higher rates of labor and environmental infringements relative to non-ESG funds, right? Funds that don't make any claims of being socially good in the same year and issued by the same asset manager, right? And these guys charge higher fees. So it's not clear what you're getting in exchange for these higher fees. And you can kind of see that this is driven by the lack of any correlation between commercial ESG ratings, right? These ratings that purport to say which firms are ethical and which firms are not. There's no correlation between these ratings and what they're actually up to, right? Which is where Violation Tracker comes in useful, in that it serves as, to me, by far the best source of hard information on corporate conduct. And so this is something that, you know, is hopefully of practical relevance, and this is the kind of thing that Violation Tracker in the US facilitates. Now, I haven't had a chance to really do the same kind of deep dive in the UK, but I've done I've just looked at the data and run a few just basic correlations and tabulations just to get a sense of what the environment is here. And you see a lot of the same things. There's once again no correlation between the commercial ESG ratings given to companies here and what they've actually been up to, right? There's no correlation between Environment Agency sanctions, Employment Tribunal settlements, HSE, workplace safety issues. There's no correlation between any of this stuff and the commercial ratings of what firms claim, you know, of which firms are good. And in light of a lot of recent scandals, you can think about, for example, the Boohoo scandal, where Boohoo turned out to have absolutely terrible labor practices, and yet was included in pretty much every major British ESG fund, right? You sort of unwittingly would buy shares in this terrible company from a labor perspective, because they had great scores, because these funds were just relying on soft information about Boohoo, right? And so this is where Violation Tracker can, especially in the UK, in an environment of historically poor disclosure and not much information about corporate conduct. This is where Violation Tracker can really make a difference in terms of helping us understand which firms are actually seem to be up to no good, which firms actually seem to be engaging in, as far as we know, reasonably fair stakeholder treatment. So I could go on for hours. I'm an academic, but I'll stop here in the interest of time. I'm happy to take any questions about this or about Violation Tracker that Phil wants to punt over to me. And thanks again for letting me talk about this.
Anish, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We're going to go to a general sort of questions section. So again, I've clicked over to gallery view so I can see everybody. I can see Lawrence has raised his hand. Lawrence, please take an opportunity to introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Lawrence Wilmold, living in England, and had previously worked in several investment companies, including Deutsche Bank. The LSE work looks to be very interesting because ESG, as you rightly say, ESG is spreading like a rash in the investment world, and there are a lot of questions that are arising out of this. We're in the business I work for, we're now trying to really take a hard look at ESG. So my question for the speaker really was, I believe that there's a huge problem associated with ESG washing, greenwashing, or telling porkies basically about your ESG record. What was the approach you took in terms of, did you look at the biggest ESG funds, or did you look at it the other way around by looking at firms such as the anecdote you mentioned about Boohoo? How do we get a grip on the scale of this?
Yeah, so what it is, I tried to be just as comprehensive as possible. So there's, I found a list, or I compiled a list of the most comprehensive list I could of ESG funds in the US, and there's a couple hundred of them. And then basically one really nice institutional feature in the US is that mutual funds must disclose a complete list of their portfolio holdings a few times per year, right? So you can actually, what you can do is you can come up with sort of a weighted average. Okay, you've got 10 shares in this company and 20 shares in that company, and you can figure out who owns how much of what firm. So you can kind of come up with like a fund level weighted average compliance score, or compliance rate, or rate of penalties, rate of violations, what have you, right? And so, which is a weighted average of the compliance behavior of the firms they own, right? And so I'm really just comparing, do these funds seem to buy more, more problematic firms than their peers? But my approach is really at the fund level, right? And you're sort of just taking, but you can map in the complete list of portfolio holdings, right? So it's taking the firm level data, aggregating it up to each fund on the basis of what they hold, and then trying to figure out who's doing what. One thing that, then I saw your question in the chat as well. I just figured I'd respond while I've got you. It would be almost impossible to do the same thing in the UK. The reason is that in the UK, funds don't have to disclose what they hold, right? Some do, and some might give like a top 10, right? But you just can't get a comprehensive list. So I couldn't replicate this here. I'd love to, but I just, you can't.
That is an interesting thing, is how could we pursue this? Do you think would it be a good idea to try to pressure the relevant authorities to get that mandatory disclosure?
I think so. And of course, one complaint that comes out of that the funds will probably push back on is that, well, it's proprietary, right? Why should we reveal our investment strategy? But in the US, what happens is you have disclosure with a lag, right? So you don't disclose it in real time. You disclose it a few months after the last quarter end or whatever.
Before, yeah.
Right. And so I don't, in terms of that, right? And to me, the sort of the problem is that forget this kind of analysis. The problem is that if I want to buy a mutual fund, I don't know what they own. Right? How can I decide if a fund is a good product for myself? Now, this is getting a little bit away from violation tracker, but I think there are a number of reasons that this kind of disclosure should absolutely be pushed for.
I think this is a really, really topical exchange between Lawrence and Anish here, because violation tracker obviously shows the data we've got. By definition, it also reflects on the data that we haven't got. And your conversation, gents, just now is reminding me of an event we had a few years ago. I've forgotten the gentleman's name. He was the shadow minister for climate change. He spoke at one of our events, and what he was saying was that 40 members of parliament had to write to the trustees of the parliamentarians' pension scheme because they wanted to know whether they were buying into high carbon asset industries. They were very naturally concerned that they were buying into companies that might not reflect their values because they had an interest in climate change and ESG and all these sorts of things. And it hit the press quite a big time in the UK because it was proving very difficult for even politicians to know what was inside their own pension schemes. And I know that this topic of transparency on holdings is of huge interest, particularly people like Tanya Youssef, who's with us today, and many, many others. So I think you're absolutely right, gents. I think we should actually pick up on that idea and use the compare contrast between UK and US on this matter to try to push for these kind of reforms. That was really interesting.
I'll just make a quick shout out to the to a group which is also at LSE called TFI or TPI, Transition Finance Initiative, I think is what they are. I'm sorry that I've lost my memory on this one, but they are putting together a database of climate-related disclosures, right. And we could possibly use that to search against some of the funds, and so the TFI are doing great work in trying to force more related disclosure about climate risk.
Thank you, Lawrence. Lawrence, if you wouldn't mind me tasking you to find a link to that and whack it in the chat. I know that there are people on this call whose session today who'd find that really good to know about. Thanks, Lawrence. Let's again go to gallery view so I can see everybody. Wave if you'd like to make a point or ask a question. Now's a good time to do it if you wish to.
Andy, I just put the link in.
Oh, thank you very much, Greg. Thank you very much indeed. I think we're good. So let's now go to Mr. Ian Veach. Ian, could you please give everybody a little bit of background? And by the way, take the opportunity to tell everybody about the VIP Mind Map initiative, just very briefly, and then share your thoughts on Violation Tracker. Ian, thank you very much.
Yeah, you always try to get mind map in, so yeah, thank you. One, I'd have to say, well, Violation Tracker is a phenomenal thing, and I must admit, if I could go back in time 4 years when I was sort of, say, in my job, when I was going, wouldn't it be great to have something that looks a bit like this? And unfortunately, my job has now moved on, but this would have made my life a lot easier. So I think that's probably a sign of just how practical this is. Yeah, I'll introduce myself quickly. I mean, my background is primarily insurance and product development, insurance and financial services, including underwriting for a couple of the larger global insurance groups. And I'm now in a semi-retired position helping insurance companies and also corporate customers in trying to understand this sort of minefield on that basis. And I think Violation Tracker comes really importantly. And I'll do it the other way around, Andy. I'll address Violation Tracker first, and then I'll do mind maps. Probably if it's easier, just to keep the flow going, because I come to this from a very practical perspective, accepting the fact that it gives us lots of data for academic research as well. But really, I mean, I work for insurance companies that hopefully are trying to do the right thing, and I think that's always important. I think as many people. Most companies are not inherently evil, although at times we do things that are perceived as evil, and many are trying to do the right thing. And when you're trying to do the right thing, life has got very, very complicated, particularly on product development and particularly on providing new coverages and supporting new projects. One, the value chains to deliver something have now become very, very fragmented. Instead of one company doing something, there's probably a mix of pension funds, fund managers, specialist service companies, insurers, distributors, all of who potentially have the capability to do the right thing and to do the wrong thing. Corporate customers who are being supported are also very complex. So, someone building a stadium in Qatar for a World Cup, which is not particularly bad, might be an Italian company supported by a US insurer. So the world is complex to understand the links between bad things in the world and who might be supporting or financing them either deliberately or accidentally. We mentioned ESG. I think there's a whole focus on ESG and reputational risk, and a big part of my last corporate role was about ensuring we were not taking risks from customers that either breached our ESG principles, not just carbon, but deforestation, many other things, but also a large extension of you don't take customers where it's going to look really bad if it appears in the front page of the papers. So one is very proactive, one is very defensive. And then on top of that, we had regulators and boards who would just expect you to be doing all these sort of things, not just once, but on an ongoing basis. And really what we lacked was some sort of simple tool to find out what each of the partners in these quite complex chains were actually up to. You know, you end up, you can do due diligence and ask management, but management always paint a certain picture. You can fall back to Dr. Google, which is always sort of useful for anecdotal stuff, but generally a lot of the regulatory problems are almost too complex to get easy coverage, because it's not an easy story to sell. So you do tend to find, you know, if you go down that route, you know, you either get end of the world type stories or lots of mitigation, when reality is probably somewhere in the middle. So I think it's phenomenally valuable to have a tool that just gives data. You know, it gives hard facts, which allows all peoples along the value chain, from customers all the way through to insurers, to banks, to funds, to at least start with what's the real story. You know, and then on the basis of what's that real story, there's either, you know, that's the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation, as you start to understand, was it a problem that then got solved, and therefore you're actually dealing with a good company? Is it a problem? It's a sign of some weak culture. Is it a problem? Is it a red flag on that whole basis? So I think Violation Tracker UK is a phenomenal tool. I think I would echo the other comments. Wouldn't it be brilliant if it could be absolutely global? Because I think it would make a lot of other people's lives very easy, except in fact it would not make the actual creators of the database life any easier. So I think, again, you know, it's a valuable tool, and the fact that no one else has done anything like this means I think there's potentially massive demand. And I would also call out, I think, you know, where there's massive demand and where corporates can see value in using it, there probably is financing as well, but that's probably a discussion for down the line.
Thank you very much, Ian. We'll park the mind map piece for another time to keep ourselves on track time-wise, but that's been very helpful indeed. Thank you, Ian. I'm going to take a few moments of everyone's time to talk about one or two things, particularly relating to the financial sector, and then we're going to hear from Lord Davies of Brixton in just 2 or 3 minutes time. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you this particular table. So what you're looking at right now, folks, is the bottom of a table that lists the amount of fines by industry. So anybody in the paints and coatings industry can be very proud that it's the least violating industry by amount of fines. Apparel is second least bad. Tobacco, surprisingly, is third least bad. And then you slowly go up and you see the amounts climbing and climbing and climbing. So agribusiness is the first at number 35, with fines totaling over £1 million. And then you go up and up and up. Oil and gas is nearly 20 million at position number 19. And then look what we get. We get financial services at the very, very top. Now, I am absolutely convinced this is a major systemic problem. Our finance sector, the sector that requires to be trusted more than any other industry, should not be anywhere near the top, I would argue. And not only is it at the top, can you see the difference between places 1 and 2? 4.5 billion compared to 1.5 billion. So that's what? 3 times worse than the place number 2. And it gets worse, folks, because if you then click on financial services, and I really do love the user friendliness of this database. You just click on financial services, as I'm about to do now. It instantly gives you the top 10, which is, you know, great to know. And as Phil mentioned earlier, it shows Barclays at the top, then Lloyds, then UBS, so on and so forth. And then you've got a listing of all of the cases, the individual cases by size of fine, Credit Suisse at the top, etc., etc. And then when you scroll down this page, you see exactly the same pattern I saw when I first stumbled across Violation Tracker, the US version, back in April last year. The same organizations are committing the same type of offenses over and over again. And this speaks to recidivism, a word that Greg Leroy taught me a year or so ago. Recidivism is where companies do something wrong and carry on doing it. So I think this points to two massive systemic questions. Number one, why is it that these financial organizations would appear to think that getting fined and carrying on is somehow acceptable? But perhaps even more importantly, and I mean this quite literally, even more importantly, what is happening to our financial regulatory framework to allow this to carry on? Surely this puts a great big question mark over the efficacy of the UK's financial services regulatory framework, especially when the harms being caused to so many people are so egregious. Everybody who's close to TTF will know that we often hear about people who've been scammed or who've lost money. We hear about people from BBRS, which is the very failing attempt to compensate victims of abusive banking behavior, etc., etc. So I personally think the violation tracker is wonderful campaign collateral, if I can use that phrase, campaign collateral to show that there's something wrong. We have the evidence. Everything we do at TTF is evidence-based, and violation tracker gives us that evidence to really show there does seem to be something going horribly wrong. I noticed that Tanielle put her hand up, so we're going to go to Tanielle, and then we're going to jump to Lord Davies of Brixton in just a moment. Tanielle, over to you, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andy. And again, thanks for this work. It's so valuable. You know that I find it incredibly useful and important. It was something that just occurred to me as you were scrolling down the sort of varying degree, and there's sort of paint at the bottom and finance all the way up at the top. Yeah. And I wondered if there's anything in the research around the size of those industries, because of course there's a lot less in paint than there is in finance, and something that, and of course that's fine, and we know that, but as you say, finance is something that is so much a part, it's such a ubiquitous part of our lives, and such an important part where trust is so important, where it governs our lives. It has incredible influence in power, and that's something that we talk about a lot. And then it goes to a very intimate part of everyone's lives as well. So it's sort of macro and micro. But I'm curious, there will be some violations in painting industries that are small and clerical. But I'm curious if we've looked at the percentage of the industry that those millions or those 100,000s are, because that might be revealing in and of itself. And I'm just wondering if we've looked at that. And that was all. Just sort of looking at those numbers, I was curious.
Tanya, I think that could be really useful to know. Let me put that one to Anish from an academic point of view. Anish, have you or have any of your colleagues done work around sort of tabulating the amount of fines by industry compared to size of industry? That could be quite interesting. Anish, any comments on that? Or Greg or Phil, if you'd like to chip in as well, please do.
Well, maybe I should just clarify something first before Anish speaks more generally, which is that those industry numbers only relate to cases that are imposed on companies that are linked to our parent company universe, right? Because, a lot of the entries that we get, for example, from the health and safety executive, do not always have industry categories associated with them. So we cannot do that breakdown for every entry in the database. Instead, we focus on those cases that are relating to our parent companies. Now, our parent companies are larger, so that there's a kind of a bias in those numbers toward cases that are associated with larger companies. And that's actually kind of more significant than the different industry sectors. So I just wanted to, make that clarification. And of course, since the banks are generally large, therefore there's also a tendency for those to kind of to feature more significantly in the list where we break things down by industry.
Thank you, Tanya and Phil. We're going to jump to Lord Davis of Brixton. Lord Davis, if I could invite you, please, to introduce yourself briefly, of course, and then just share your thoughts on Violation Tracker UK. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks, first of all, to Andy for introducing me to Violation Tracker. It's tremendous, and I think it's going to be extremely useful. Just a word about myself. I've always worked in the financial services industry of one sort or another, from being an insurance clerk to a partner in a leading firm of consulting actuaries. For the last 30 years or so, I've been advising trade unions, principally on collective bargaining and issues relating to pensions. I've just retired from that because a year ago, somewhat surprisingly, I became a member of the House of Lords. For those who, it's the sort of second chamber of the UK Parliament, almost wholly appointed, and with a few, surprisingly, hereditary peers left. In the House of Lords, you've got various jobs, one of which is looking at legislation, looking at the rules, see how they're going to work. But the other job is to hold the government to account. And we can do that by asking questions and promoting debates and generally highlighting issues. And one of the issues that I am and do intend to work on is financial services. And part of the government's job in financial services is to provide effective and proportionate regulators.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be using this, and so clearly Violation Tracker is going to be ideal for picking up where gaps are appearing. Of course, it's necessary to look behind the figures, as someone's already suggested. If there's a low level of violations, it could be that the regulation just isn't very good and it's not picking up the violations that are taking place. And Andy, just to conclude, Andy has highlighted this issue. I think there is a systemic problem with financial services. I'm sorry to say this. People do like someone to hold their hand when they're confronted with financial issues. And so we do need the financial services industry. But I think it suffers from, well, basically what the apocryphal story, Willie Sutton was a real character. He was a real bank robber. And when asked why rob banks, it's because that's where the money is. And I think the same thing applies to financial services. We're always going to be struggling to keep everyone on the straight and the narrow because there's a lot of money involved and people will be tempted. I think the specific issue, just to conclude, the specific issue is the way it works at the moment for much of the financial services industry. Fines and charges, it's just a cost of business. Yes. It's not seen as a legal punishment. It's just seen as a cost of business. You have to pay these fines, and they go on, as Andy says, as recidivists doing the same thing again and again. Yeah. I think part of the solution is you've got to make individuals personally responsible, and that will go a long way, in my view, to addressing this issue. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in sort of 5 or 10 minutes. If anyone's got any particular points they want to put to me, that would be great. But it's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure that this is going to be a valuable tool in through my position in Parliament, holding the government to account, but also regulators, because they are an arm of government. Even the ones that are self-governing, they only really have power because of the powers which the government has given them.
Absolutely. That was extremely interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Davis of Brixton. Thank you. We're extremely keen to get parliamentarians to become more aware of this. So you might be happy to help us organise. For example, we could do a briefing in Parliament for some of your peers and some of your colleagues as well. I'm going to touch on one particular point that Lord Davidson-Brixton mentioned before I go to any other comments and questions, and that is this issue about the systemic nature of the problems in financial services. And Phil very topically mentioned earlier today that there is an attempt by government at the moment, and by the way, I'm not making a party's political point at all, but there is an attempt by government at the moment to introduce a competition or a competitiveness objective for the financial regulators. I personally think this would be disastrous because the financial regulators are already conflicted. How can they truly put the interest of consumers first and foremost if they also have a statutory objective to increase the size and the success of the UK's financial industry? To my mind, these two issues are not compatible. And this takes me to Justice Louis Brandeis, who in 1914 wrote a book about all these sorts of issues, all the conflicts of interest within the financial sector. And he's the chap that gave us the phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant, a phrase that we within the Transparency Task Force use all the time. We believe it to be true. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if you read Justice Louis Brandeis' work, he really does talk and write so eloquently about the idea that financial regulators must not be allowed to become conflicted, must not be allowed to get captured by the industry they're supposedly regulating. And there are some concerns amongst some people in the UK that the gentleman whose job was to promote UK PLC at the London Stock Exchange is now the chief executive of our financial regulator. And whether it's coincidence or not, our financial regulator is now being asked to consider taking on some kind of competitiveness agenda. So this is not directly about Violation Tracker, but in a way it kind of directly is. Violation Tracker really isn't just the data inside the database. It's how we can use it, how we can capitalize on it, how we can leverage it for the purposes of reform in the interest of society as a whole. So that's my my sort of few thoughts on that particular matter. I'm going to go to gallery mode again to invite anybody to make a point or ask a question if they'd like to do so. Just wave away if you'd like to. It looks like everyone's pretty much okay, which is great. In which case, I think what we ought to do is reflect on the very good news that all of us in the UK can now, without having to spend a dime or even a penny, we can now access a wonderful new public utility to download data and to access data about violations. This is definitely going to be a positive in terms of accelerating reform of corporate conduct in the UK, because for the very first time we can properly shine a big bright light on the actual conduct of companies based upon the amount of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct and mis-selling they do. That's fantastic news. So in a moment, I'm going to invite everybody to thank Phil and Anthony and Arlene and Greg and all their colleagues in the USA who've worked remarkably hard in a very short period of time to make Violation Tracker UK available to us. As I said earlier, please don't think of yourselves as passive passengers on this journey, the Violation Tracker UK journey. Please do something to help promote it, do something to use the data, do something to raise awareness, and consider yourselves part of the team. Everybody ought to get involved with helping to promote this wonderful utility, because it really is a damn good public utility that we can all make great use of. Another
Thanks
way
again
of
to Anthony K. Bagley and to Dr. Raghunandan. And we are available to do more trainings like this. If people have conferences or events in which they'd like us to zoom in, we're here for you.
Absolutely. And one way of looking at Violation Tracker is to think of it as an addition to the very long list of USA exports such as Levi's and Coca-Cola and Harley Davidson motorbikes and Elvis Presley and all the rest of it. So we've now got Violation Tracker UK as well. Wonderful news. Can we please show our appreciation to everybody that's been involved, Anish and Greg and Phil and Arlene and Anthony, everybody that's been involved in making this a possibility in a relatively short period of time. It's been wonderful. And in response to Marissa's question, yes, Marissa, we will circulate the chat notes so everybody can access the links that were provided earlier. I think we can wrap it up there. We're pretty much bang on time. That's great. Thanks, guys and girls. Thank you very much. Cheerio. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.